Hello, this is Dr. Asay. This lecture is going to add to some information found in Chapter 4 of your textbook, along with pages 26 through 45. I'm going to discuss the literature review. It may sound like I'm talking about this through the perspective of writing a literature review. In this class, you're not expected to write a full lit review, but walking you through the steps will help you understand how this important component of any research project. So understanding the lit review is the first part that you need to understand as you learn more about research methods. So in this particular lecture, which is part 1, we're going to talk about what a literature review is and how to get started on them. And then in the second part, we'll talk more about how to do a lit review. And at the end of this lecture, I want to talk through a few pages in your textbook and point out some things so that you don't miss those. So we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, when you're working with a lit review, you need to be very, very familiar with how a research article is set up so that you can find the pieces that you need. I know some of you have done a lot of research and that's great, but I'm gonna address this from the very beginning so that we don't miss out on any pieces. And I hope that it may be useful to some of you. First of all, in the research world, we often talk about peer-reviewed, refereed, or scholarly journals. And we mean the same thing with all of those terms. These are journals that have a review board and research or articles are submitted to them, and they're reviewed often by you don't know who the reviewers are. Although if you publish a lot and you read the journals and you're associated with some of these professional organizations, you sometimes have a pretty good idea just from the comments that come back on what you've submitted as to who actually reviewed your article that you submitted. Now, peer-reviewed or refereed journals, such as the one that I show here, the American Educational Research Journal, I thought that was one that a lot of you may be familiar with. Those journals can also contain some editorials, and every once in a while there will be a month-by-month editorial and rebuttal as experts and researchers argue back and forth about something, and that can always be very interesting too. These journals, depending on the organization that publishes them and reviews them, they sometimes actually have reviews of research or reviews of groups of research. And those can be very helpful as you're looking at things too. And then some of them include simply news, what's happening out there in the field. Now, practitioner journals are also out there, and I've got one example there that some of you may have seen. Practitioner journals are incredible, especially for classroom teachers. They usually, if they contain research, it's usually in a very user-friendly manner. It usually focuses on the organization that's got the journal out there. So, for example, ISTE, International Society of Technology Educators. Everything in there is for practitioners to use in classrooms and in setting policy and different things like that. And so they're also very useful. Then there are handbooks. Handbooks usually have an editor or a group of editors, and they will pick a theme or a yearly review, and they compile the research into chapters that's been submitted during that year. So, for example, I did some research with another professor. It was published in a journal and as original research, but then we were asked to also contribute it to a handbook of case studies, and all the handbook was full. Each chapter was a different case study from researchers somewhere in the world, and that's how a handbook is usually done. They can be really valuable because if you know what the theme is or what you're looking for, it gives you a quick range of perspectives on that theme or that topic. And then another one that I wanted, another one that I wanted to pull out for you is conference proceedings. And these are usually online, and they are usually a repository after a conference has been held. So presentation I made to the National Research in Technology Education. Then after I make the presentation at the annual conference, then I'm expected to clean it up, put it in a format, and it goes into the repository so that people can get to my conference presentation there. So those are 4 different types of sources where you can find research, and I wanted to make sure that you were clear on what each of those was. Now let's stop a minute and take a look at the anatomy of a research article, and I've just pulled one up that I've referenced in something I did so that we could look at the pieces of it. And over the last century, this pattern has evolved. And I'm going to start with this is a research article that is actually very qualitative, but it follows the format of quantitative research. Remember that quantitative is empirical, and we're trying to look at the data and analyze and form support for a hypothesis. And qualitative research is more observational and organic. And as I go through the data I collect in a qualitative research setting, I'm sorting through it and grouping it and making sense and finding patterns in the data, usually observational or interviews and those sorts of things. So there may not always have labels or headings, and those vary quite a bit as you go through different research articles. But in general, the pattern is always the same. Starting with the title, and I did not pick a good example for this one. Generally, the titles of research articles are not cute. They are usually very specific, and they're sometimes very long because the title describes what is going to happen in that research article. When you get cute or try to be fun with them, it kind of it can send up kind of a cloud of what the research really is about. So the convention is to be very specific in your title. And then, of course, the authors are listed, and then the abstract. And one thing about research articles, the abstract in a research article gives away the ending. So in the abstract, you should be able to find a sentence or two about what the results were and what the researchers found. You don't keep it a secret in a research article. Right in the beginning, in the introduction of a research article, the researchers build the case and set the context, and they make a rationale for why they did their research. And this is often called the literature review, especially in your career as a grad student, possibly even when you go on to a doctoral program. The literature review, you will write so many of these that it's just amazing. You'll be so surprised at yourself. Now, in a qualitative research article, the lit review part, where you build the context and you add information from other researchers in, is sometimes more organic and spread throughout the article, so that as you find a pattern, then you actually go out and try to see what others have found with the same kind of pattern, or what they've said about what you saw or what came up in an interview. In a quantitative research setting, the lit review is always done first. You can have a general idea or a general topic you want to research. You can even have a really, really good idea of how you want to set it up. But you can't go any further until you build the context, the rationale, and the credibility for what you're going to do. And so the the literature review becomes really, really important. In a quantitative article, you will then have a really detailed section on the methodologies. This should be so detailed that someone else could come along and follow the procedures and replicate the study. You detail everything from the ages and the genders of the children to the kind of analysis that you did, the methodologies you used for setting up a model that you did. You include the instruments that you used. If you make your own survey or test, you include how you validated it before you actually used it in this study. All of that goes into the methodologies. Now, in qualitative research, it's going to be different because in the methodologies section, you're going to be focusing more on the setting of the research and the researcher's role and the subjects and those sorts of things and how the observations were done or how the interviews were designed or the survey questions. But it's still very much a detail of so that your reader has a really good picture of what happened in this research. Then there is a results section. This is sometimes combined with the discussions, but for this purpose, we'll just call it the results section. And this is where you outline what happened. You explain here's where you're going to have all your statistical models and your tolerances. All of that is going to be spelled out here in your results, often with a lot of charts, graphs, whatever you need. Most peer-reviewed journals kind of discourage a lot of charts and graphs. I remember years ago I had an article published, and looking back on it, it was incredibly top-heavy with graphs because in my mind that was the best way to show what we had discovered as we did this work. And of course, it came right back to us to cut out 2/3 of the graphs. It was just really too heavy in charts. And some people love them and some people despise them, so you have to find a happy medium. And what you choose to put in for charts is very much based on the journal and its audience and what the audience expects. Then there should be some kind of discussion. This is where you get to interpret your results. You get to explain why you think it happened that way or didn't happen that way, or and what you would change. This is the place where you also write in that this is where you see there were some things that interfered with your results, or why something that confounded it or got in the way. And this is also where you will connect back your results to that original research problem that you set up at the beginning of your research. And then last of all, we use an APA style in educational research. And this section is called the references, not the bibliography or sources or anything like that. It's called references, and we do use the APA style. Now, one thing I would like to point out about the references. This is a gold mine of where to find more information about a topic you're studying. The article may not be all that great, or the data may not be what you need as you build your research, but go through that references section very carefully, because several pieces will jump out at you and you'll go, oh my gosh, I've got to find that article. It sounds like it might be what I need. So it's a great place to gather ideas and more articles that your search may not have turned up. Okay, now in the rest of this lecture, we're going to focus on the lit review part of a research article, because that's where you will start your graduate career and you will have to do this over and over again. The lit review is near the very beginning of the research write-up, and it's the researcher's opportunity to provide the context and the rationale. If I'm interested in the development of literacy skills in English for immigrant students from different backgrounds, I need to know the work that's already been done and what is already known about this. Good science builds on good science. So I need to get in there and dig and find out what's already been done and know that body of research very, very well. It's amazing that sometimes you'll start into a lit review and be planning something. I'm going to set up this research protocol, or I'm going to do these kinds of observations. And as you get into your literature review and you see what's out there, all of a sudden something may just jump out at you and it completely changes what you decide to do. It's a very, very valuable process. The research that you do needs to be based on the existing literature and findings, the topic, usually in a statement, and the problem to be addressed. So you have to kind of triangulate between these three pieces. And let me repeat that. The existing literature, what's already known out there, your topic, and then the way that you see it as a problem. And you always start by looking at the existing literature. The extent of the literature review really does depend on your audience. So it's going to be very different when you do a dissertation than when you publish an article. Some journals, for example, want just enough to contextualize the research, to put it into a context for their readers. And those journals make assumptions that their readers have a common knowledge base about the subject. If I'm developing a better way to use sutures for abdominal surgery, my audience is not going to need an extensive history of the changes in sutures over the centuries. They're going to be a bunch of doctors, and I can make the safe assumption that I don't need to include that in my literature search or review. In other cases, though, the audience is broader and they may be coming at your research from different areas of expertise. And then they may need more information in order to understand your research problem and then the data that you come up with. And in the case of a dissertation, a very extensive literature review is expected. It actually ends up being a huge, huge portion of your dissertation. And that is in part because you also have to establish your credibility when you're writing a dissertation. You have to prove that you know your research area inside and out and upside down. Now, when grad students start working with literature reviews, there's some common mistakes they make. First of all, a literature review is different than a research paper. And I see that this slide isn't real great, but when you're doing a research paper, you're being very purposeful about it, and you're going to have a thesis, and then you're going to pull in the research that supports that thesis. It's kind of like building an argument, and that's a good research paper, focused on something. A literature review, however, you are building the foundation and setting the context for the research that you're going to do. And so you're building a rationale for why this research needs to be done. So they're two different animals, and grad students often get confused about that. Your literature review is not a list. I've seen a couple of really horrible examples where the person just simply started listing out research that had been done in that field. It was horrible to read. It didn't make any sense. I couldn't see where they were going with this, and it was just an awful experience. So a lit review is not a list of all of the research that's been done, nor is it a summary of the articles. So a lit review is not simply Wilbers and Conger did this research, and then here's what they did. And then the next paragraph, Asay and Petro did this one, and here's a summary. it has to have a flow and an organization to it. So be very careful about those common mistakes. Now, this is actually a piece of a lit review that I've quoted in here. And this is from an article, actually from the article that I showed you the anatomy of. So in this example, notice what the authors have done, and this is done really well. They have a topic sentence and an explanation from the existing research. So the parts I've underlined there, they say analogical reasoning is a key feature of learning processes within a constructive perspective. So there's their topic. Then they back it up with Rummelhart and Norman's description. Look down by the number 2. So new schemata, conceptual frames arise through, and they build on that. Finally, they write about how that has then evolved. So look down by 3. Conceptual change researchers have adopted Rummelhart and Norman's distinction between continuous growth and discontinuous change, etc. And conceptual change perspectives have shown to be. So they didn't summarize these pieces of research. What they did was they connected them together to paint a picture of analogical reasoning that then leads to conceptual change according to some of the research. Sorry about that. So the lit review is done to give you an idea as a reader whether this research is going to be helpful to you or not. So it connects all that previous research to your current problem, gives it the context, the credibility, and of the previous research. And you can, in a lit review, you can sometimes call into question some previous research and point out sometimes there's an anomaly. So there will be a piece of research that none of the other researchers have ever been able to replicate, or they don't agree with it. And so that's not a problem at all. Unwritten or unspoken, you have to develop your credibility through your literature review if you're going to get published. The lit review also helps you to refine the problem that you're going to work on. It lets you look at the approaches that others have taken and narrow down and focus on the topic. You'll very often find when you start into your lit review that the problem you thought you were addressing is much too broad, and you have to narrow it down and make it manageable. It also gives you an opportunity to look at how other people have operationally defined the concepts that you're working with in your work. And it's a really important place to show the significance of what you're doing, and that this is a problem the world needs solved. It also gives you a chance to address the methodologies that have previously been used, including the limitations and hurdles that people ran into. So if you're doing a qualitative study of something, you can build a case by looking at the methodologies that others used for the niche that you want to fill or you want to add into that body of work for people. It also is a place where you can show the instruments that have been used previously, the justification for the way that you're going to analyze things because it's already been analyzed that way, or analyzed a different way and it didn't give the results that helped us in any way. A lit review must address contradictory results. So if you have a hypothesis and you're pretty sure you're going to find things the way that you think you're going to find them, to just pretend that there's previous research out there that flies in the face of that is just laughable. You need to acknowledge it, address it, and then give reasons why you're going to approach it differently or why you think your results will be different. And as you get into this, you'll find that others, if you're on the right track, have already reconciled it, or there may be a real division in the field and there will be multiple camps who frequently argue back and forth. Welcome to Research with People. Your lit review will also help you develop your hypothesis because you're going to better be able to predict what's going to happen because of what's been previously done. And this is also really important when you're working with some of the statistical measures so that you are able to figure out your sample size for the power that you need for a particular effect size, for example. Don't worry about those terms too much. I don't want to get anybody worried about it. But when you look at the numbers that other people had in their sample size, you can then build a case for either a fewer numbers or greater numbers. You know, if I have 50 more subjects, maybe I can find an effect that this person wasn't able to with fewer subjects and those sorts of things. And then I know I've talked about this before in our very first lecture, and I know that Dr. Marchand brought it up in the second group of lectures also. Everything you do in research is done through a theoretical framework. And your lit review gives you an opportunity to clearly express and articulate what theories, what theoretical basis there is for your research and that lens that's going to be, everything's going to be done through. So as we wrap up here, this introduction to what a lit review is, remember, it's your way to make connections among the body of research that's already been done out there, to provide the context for what you're going to do and the theoretical lens you're going to approach things through. And really, really important, it's going to let you create the rationale for the research that you are then going to do. Now, if you'll turn for a minute in your textbook, you can pause this if you need to get your textbook out a little bit. There were a few things in chapter 4 that I wanted to point out. If I can find chapter 4 here really quickly for you. It does exist in this book. Okay. Chapter 4 is really especially useful for talking through some of the examples that they give here. So they talk at the beginning, and I'm on page 73, about refining your research problem, very much like I just talked about in this lecture. Some of the excerpts that are given on pages 74 and 75 are really, really important. You really need to be able to know the literature well enough that you can identify problems in other people's research. And this very much depends on your audience and your purpose for doing the research. But when you find something that doesn't sit right or is totally wrong, you need to be able to point that out